You mentioned some legislation that I hadn't actually heard about before, and maybe we can talk a bit about it. Some things that I didn't know about. Project BioShield, I thought was really interesting, and also some of this legislation, the PrEP Act of 2005. When I spoke to Bobby Kennedy, he mentioned, I think it was the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act in '86 that Reagan put in that initially removed that liability. That blew my mind, actually. I don't know where to start here. Maybe some people that don't know what we're talking about, maybe you can walk us through some of these major moments and acts that shaped this industry.
Well, Bobby's correct. I mean, the thing that caused this big ramp up in the schedule was the 1986 National Vaccine Injury Compensation Act that was signed into law by Reagan. And when that happened, you couldn't sue the pharmaceutical industry anymore, and it gave them a liability protection unlike anything that had ever happened before. And, and so suddenly it's like, I mean, think about it. If you're a vaccine manufacturer and you have no liability for your faulty products, which in 2002, I believe, the US Supreme Court said, vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. And you don't have any incentive at all to make them safer, because who's going to sue me? I just stick with the products I have. And they knew that they were harming children. They knew that they were harming children. And so the Congress made them create the injury compensation program so that if you were injured by a vaccine, you should be able to apply through the Federal Court of Claims for compensation. Very few people know about it. Only about 25% of people who actually file a claim actually get compensated. It was supposed to be a non-adversarial court. It's extremely adversarial. I've testified in the court a couple times. I know other people that have and say they're not going back. I know Judy talked about it, about testifying in the vaccine court and how it was just a scam. It's a horrible place. It's a horrible place for parents, for everybody. It's a really bad deal. It really needs to be revamped. So that was in 1986. That gave them this level of protection, but it only protected them for the vaccines that are on the childhood schedule. And that's why when they come out with all these new vaccines, why they cram them into the kids' schedule so they can be completely covered. That's why they added the flu shot to starting at 6 months of age in babies, so that they could have liability protection for their flu shot, their faulty products. So that was in '86. Then then we had in 2001, we had 9/11. And so after 9/11 happened, there was a push for about 2 years to revaccinate, to pull out the smallpox vaccine and start revaccinating the entire population with the smallpox vaccine, on the outside, very, very, very rare possibility that there may be a bioterrorism attack with smallpox. Because we stopped vaccinating for the smallpox in 1972. And there were only 2 known locations that still housed the original varicella major smallpox virus. One's in Russia, and the other's at the CDC. That's it. But somehow they figured that could somehow get out, and we needed to revaccinate the entire population again. I went to several of those meetings and they fortunately, calmer brains prevailed, and they didn't decide to do that. But that's what started the whole push to be concerned about bioterrorism attacks. And that was in 2001. So in 2003, they passed a piece of legislation called Project BioShield. And Project BioShield was supposed to be funded with $5.6 billion over 10 years, and created a permanent source of public health funding for emergencies that they could declare, or if there was any thought of a bioterrorism attack. That all of a sudden there was immediate money there. And what it did is it would give the pharmaceutical industry money to start to develop a vaccine or a therapeutic pill or a cure for any sort of bioterrorism attack. And if there wasn't any attack that came, the government guaranteed the pharmaceutical industry they would buy back their products. And if you want to make a bunch of products and you don't have anybody that's willing to buy them, we'll buy them back. So the taxpayer lost on both ends of that, right? You put money in that they could develop it, and if nobody wanted to buy it, we'll buy it back. So that doubles the amount of money that goes to the drug companies, but the taxpayers take the hit on that. It also put into place something called an Emergency Utilization Authority, which is they are using now. It's an EUA, which means that if it's safe enough, you don't have to prove it to be safe, but if it's safe enough, then you can go ahead and use it mass scale on everybody. And that was part of the Project BioShield Act. So that was in 2003. So it's all about money, guaranteed purchases. They could get, instead of $100,000 funding on the front end, they would get $25 million funding on the front end. And they could issue this EUA, this Emergency Utilization Act authority to just start using it. Well, the drug companies weren't happy enough with that. They weren't happy enough with the money and the guaranteed purchases. They wanted to have the same level of protection for their faulty bioterrorism products that they were going to develop that they got in 1986 for the Childhood Injury Compensation Act for the childhood vaccines. They weren't happy enough with that. So between 2003 and 2005, there were something like 13 or 14 bills that were introduced through Congress to try to once again give them that protection. Nobody, like a lot of bills, they never moved forward. And so finally there was one that looked like it was getting some traction. And when that was getting some traction and people started hearing about this complete and utter complete protection, there was a big blow up on social media, and all the activist groups said, we can't do this to them. They can't, they're not going to fast track this product and have protection. So they kind of dropped it. And then at the last minute, it was December 17th of 2005. The Senator Bill Frist, who is the senator from Tennessee, and went over at 11:30 p.m. on a Saturday night after a defense appropriation bill had already been signed off on, and most of the people on that committee had gone home. They walked over to the House. They took the legislation from the Senate. They walked over to the House and they demanded that it get tacked on the back of this defense appropriation bill. And it was called Division E, Division E like elephant, when it first started. They had skinnied it down to a 42-page piece of legislation, and they insisted, and it got tacked onto that defense appropriation bill. After the first of the year, it got given a different name, and it was called the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, which is the PrEP Act for short. And what that actually does is anytime that the head of HHS, who like right now is Alex Azar, can activate that piece of legislation for a public health emergency, what it does is it gives the drug companies, for anything they create, whether it's a pill, an IV therapy, a biologic, a technology, a piece of software, or a vaccine, it gives them 100% liability protection. Even if that product kills or maims millions of people, there is no recourse unless you can convince the US Attorney General that those were created under what's called willful misconduct, that they actually intentionally made something to harm you. And even if you could prove it through FOIA requests of text messages and emails or whatever, they could actually do it. The Attorney General has the right to say, we're not moving forward with enforcement action. There's no compensation program set up. There is one that they could be funded, but Congress would have to convene and fund it, and they would have to define a list of injuries that they were willing to pay compensation for. So they have complete and utter 100% liability protection. So fast forward from 2005 to 2020. That bill got activated February 4th of this year, and it got put into the Federal Register on March the 17th. The pharmaceutical industry will be operating under this complete umbrella of protection until which time Alex Azar decides that we no longer have a coronavirus emergency. So anything that they make for this coronavirus thing, technology, tracking technologies, anything, microchipping, any of those things, zero liability protection. And when Bill Gates starts talking about that we need to give indemnification to the Gates Foundation and Gavi and UNICEF and the World Health Organization for if they fast track these products, he's going to lift the language right out of this bill that's already been on the books for 15 years and take it out globally. It's the scariest thing I've ever seen, Brian. And to me, it's the most important thing that people need to know about when they think that, oh, I'm going to go get that vaccine right away because I want to get back into life or I don't want to get corona infection, is to know that there's no oversight on it at all. They can create anything they want.